cultures of AI. Should you trust ML or ML? That's a hilarious joke. Hopefully by the end of the talk you will know enough to laugh. As I'll explain during the talk, I'm not an AI person, but we've all seen AI in the news. We all know it's important. So I'm going to try to be taking on in future some of the job of explaining that to the public. Now, you guys are not ordinary Joe public. I hope I will have pitched this at the right level, but often I get to stand up here and say, I am an expert in this. I'm not an expert in this. I will talk about my relationship to it, but I'm not an expert. But to deal with, and I hope to, since there are lots of clever people here, to inspire you to start thinking about this. Maybe there's some things that you will want to do, but I don't want to claim special expertise. I think we all have the relevant expertise. What I hope to do is inspire some of you to follow up on the expertise that you have. And I guess if I say anything you don't understand, raise your hand and ask a question. And if you want to argue with me, save that to the end. So, one reason this has all become so important is that ChatGPT is everywhere in the news. So let me start by saying a little bit about ChatGPT, which is sometimes, have people heard this term stochastic parrot for ChatGPT? A couple of you. And raise your hand, have you used ChatGPT or another? Well, yeah, everybody. Right, we're all very curious. So actually this goes back a long way. Right, how many people know about Joseph Weizenbaum and ELIZA? A fair number of you, great. So ELIZA was one of the first programs in artificial intelligence, and it mimicked a Rogerian therapist. It would say back to you what you said to it. So, if you mentioned some noun, it would say, explain more about, and then it would repeat the noun. And it had a couple of things built in. So, for instance, for certain words, like mother, it would say, tell me, if you had a sentence with mother in it, it would say, tell me more about your family. So, if you were complaining and you said, he was a real motherfucker, it would say, tell me more about your family. And there's a famous incident where Weizenbaum's secretary sat down and started working with ELIZA, and she was telling it, fairly deep secrets. It was working as a therapist. And he said, it's just a computer program. And she said, leave the room. I want to talk to ELIZA. So she was convinced, even though it was a very, very simple program. And I think this is something to keep in mind, is that when we think of these programs as intelligent, there is intelligence there. It ain't in the program. It's in your head. It seems intelligent to you because you are intelligent, and it's mimicking just enough that you follow that. So here's Brian Kernighan. He wrote the textbook on C in the C book. How many people have read the C book? How many people remember the exercise in the C book on Markov chains? So there's a little exercise in the book that says, right, let's pick a number n. I'm going to set n to be 3. And you're going to just read a text, and for every triple of words in that text, make a count. And then you'll pick the first 2 words at random, and after that, you look up those 2 words in the triple, and there'll be several different triples, and you pick the next word proportional to, proportional to how many of each of those there were. So if you give it the Bible, it will spout out something that sounds a lot like the Bible. I actually did that exercise. So again, right, this is doing something very simple, just counting how many times each triple of words occurs, but you can generate something that just picks the next word proportional to that does pretty well. So now we get this paper, Attention is All You Need, by these people, which appeared in a conference on neural information processing. And this was the thing that started off the work on large language models. So this was the key idea underneath these things. And it was basically just what I just said, with Markov chains, except instead of counting words, you build a neural net whose job is to predict what is the next word in this sequence. That's it. What word is likely to appear next in this sequence, given the other words I've said? And there are other tricks on top of that, but that's the basic trick. That's all there is to it. So as we said, this has become very popular. It's good as a search technique. So I showed up right the last time I was here. I took my wife to buy some beautiful amber jewelry, and we wanted to get some more. I wanted to take her to get some more. So what street was it that we went to? I couldn't remember. So you ask Google, it gives you this, which isn't too helpful. And if you look a little bit down further, it says it's Florianska Street. Or you can go to ChatGPT, and it'll give you the answer right away. Just based on probability of words, nothing else. Now, notice this is just based on probability of words. So everybody will have heard about the poor lawyer who went to this thing, and it gave him a brief with lots of correct-sounding legalese, lots of references and so on. But the judge was not amused because the judge discovered that none of those references existed. The guy who used it didn't bother to check. Right? It sounded very plausible. It looked very plausible, but there was nothing there. Right? So, in fact, when I use the system, the first thing that comes up says, be aware. This may lie to you, basically. It gives lots of things you need to worry about. But most importantly, it says, be aware that this is not necessarily going to be the truth. So there's so people sometimes talk about AI systems hallucinating. So when it gave those references, it was hallucinating. A psychologist wrote a paper saying, this shouldn't be called hallucination, that's a perceptual thing. It should be called confabulation. But I don't think that's the right technical word either, so let me introduce you to the technical word that I think we should use, bullshit. And I mean this in a very precise sense. There are philosophers that have written books about bullshit. I think it's Harry Frankfurt, where he points out, right, what does bullshit mean? It means you're saying something so that it sounds good, but you have no care at all about whether it is true or not. And if you think about how these systems are working, trying to predict what is the next word that comes here, it's exactly about making it sound good, but there's no reference whatsoever to truth in these systems. The only reference to truth is accidental, because it turns out that if you pick the next word that sounds good, very often that's because it's the right answer. So that's why Florianska Street came up right away when I asked for it. Not because it was the answer, not because it knew anything about the world, but just because it sounded right. So, backing up a bit, so I wanted to start with something quite specific, ChatGPT, but let's back up a little bit and talk more about AI in general. So there's this question, right? Is AI an existential threat? And how many people know Betteridge's law? Just a couple of you. So you've now learned another useful technical term, Betteridge's law. Betteridge's law says if you read a headline, and the headline is in the form of a question, the answer will be no. Right? And this is logical, because if they could say something, they would say it. They don't have the evidence for it, so they just ask it as a question. Right? You can always ask something as a question. So is AI an existential threat? Well, Nick Bostrom, for instance, back in 2003, he's a philosopher, he wrote a paper saying, well, we might take an AI system and say, make as many paper clips as you can, and it will go off like, just like the Sorcerer's Apprentice in the old Walt Disney film with Mickey Mouse, right? So there he said, clean the room, and it made an infinite number of rooms to clean the room. Here it might go off and make an infinite number of paper clips. It just won't stop. So he said, maybe we need to worry about this. How many people remember the old Star Trek episode with Harry Mudd? Mudd's women, and they were all robots. And the way you stop the robots is Kirk says, listen very carefully, everything Spock says is true. And then Spock says, I am lying. Right? And the poor android smoke starts coming out of its ears. So even back then, right, I was a young kid back then. You might not believe it, but I used to be a young kid. And even then I went, well, wait a minute. If it knew enough to understand the English, it would know enough to understand what a paradox is and to understand that paradoxes don't necessarily have a resolution. If it knew enough to understand the sentence, it would know enough not to blow up just because it heard the sentence. And it's the same thing, right? If you've got a plant making paper clips, it's going to know a lot about resources. It will know about allocating resources safely. Surely by that point, it will have had Asimov's 3 laws built into it. The first of which is never do anything which causes a human to come to harm. So by the time that you had something that you could tell it to make paper clips, it will certainly be, this is sometimes called the alignment problem, it will certainly be aligned at least enough to know don't turn human beings into paper clips. We don't have enough metal in us anyway. Much more recently, there was this petition that circulated about a year ago, signed by many prominent computer scientists. So I began by saying, I don't know anything about AI. These people do. And they said, look, this should be a global priority. Very recently, somebody just came out and said, look, we were very concerned about atomic weapons. As soon as they could do controlled fusion, it was only 3 years until they had atomic weapons. And he suggested that that's the kind of clock we're on. And if you look at something like ChatGPT, that seems plausible. But why does it seem plausible? Because you are a general intelligence, not because it is a general intelligence. And so I think maybe suggesting that it's just 3 years, as I say, I'm not an expert in this field, but I think maybe that's an exaggeration. Eventually, certainly there will be problems from general AI, but in fact, right, many people say, I think I would agree with them, this is maybe a bit of a distraction because there are a lot of problems right now. So let me go through some of the more. So this is a problem, right? These experts say it's a problem. I agree with them. We should be doing something about that. But there are other things that are even more urgent. So let's talk about some of those. So not is AI an existential threat, but just is AI a threat? And in fact, we don't need to pose that as a question. Just let me give you some examples. So, how many people have heard the term algorithmic bias? Right, great, lots of you are familiar with this idea. So look at that image. What do you think that would resolve to? Yeah, that's obviously Barack Obama. But there's a system called Pulse, and you feed it in, and what gives you is that. Right? And this is a clear illustration of the kind of biases that can be built into systems. So, right, you train the system, who should you hire? Well, it turns out everybody you've hired in the past was a white male who went to Cambridge, so you only hire white males that went to Cambridge. Right? So it's a real problem handing over decisions to these systems. And not least because these systems are often using neural nets, they can't explain the reason. It won't say, oh, well, I did it because everybody else was a white male who went to Cambridge, so I'll hire a white male. You're okay, John. I'll hire everybody else who's a white male who went to Cambridge. So there's a lot of talk about we need explainable AI, and this is one reason why it can help you deal with issues like bias, and there are many other things that you need to do. When this image was published, Yann LeCun, the head of the AI section at Meta, said, well, it just did that because it was only trained on white males. If you only trained it on black people, it would have given you a black person. It's not prejudiced. Well, yes, the software itself has no prejudice built in, but the training data does, and the training data is important. So in fact, the lesson you should take away is not the software itself is not prejudiced, but the training data is really important, and we need to think about diversity and representation when we look at training data. Who's heard the term deep fake? Yeah, most of you. So there's a camera called Nuka, and you give it an image like, you use it to actually take an image. It's a 3D printed camera. This was done by some artists. And you take a picture of somebody, and then what comes out is that. And, right, AI has gotten quite good at generating fake images that look quite realistic. And of course, this is what they did to start a conversation, because it's art. But of course, exactly the same techniques have been used to take images of women that didn't even know the images were being taken and to turn them into quite explicit pornography. And then it's put up on the web, and there are no laws against it, so it's very difficult for them to get it taken down. So that's a real issue that we need to face. And then deepfakes are quite good at creating realistic images, realistic voices, so of course they can be used for misinformation. One example, Joe Biden was running to be put on the ballot in New Hampshire because there was a technical difficulty that meant he was a write-in, but this person organized for many, many people to receive auto calls that sounded like Joe Biden saying, "Save your vote for November. Do not go out and write me in." Complete fake, complete misinformation. And the fellow who did it has just been fined $5 million US, if I'm remembering correctly. And the telecom that distributed the messages has been fined $2 million. But that, is well after the fact. So there's very little that I can see in the news right now about people saying, wait a minute, so in the UK there's an election coming up on the 4th of July. I'm sort of expecting some kind of deep fake to be released on the 3rd of July. I'm just hoping all the newsrooms, the important ones, have lined things up so that as soon as that happens they can circulate the news, no, that one's a fake. But I'm not sure that they are that organized. And of course, there's an election coming up in the US. It's traditional in the US. The election happens in November. Typically, there's something that happens late in October where some bad news comes out about one of the candidates, surreptitiously released often by the other team, called the October surprise. So be prepared for this year's October surprise to be technologically enhanced. A completely different issue, data colonialism. So when you read about ChatGPT, it's like, oh, it scratched the internet, it pulled in a lot of data, we'll talk more about that in a minute, and it automatically, with no human help, it then built these neural networks and it generates these things. So all of this happens completely automatically, no humans involved. This is actually not the way AI works. So even those things, they get trained. So I'll give you an example. I'll tell you more a bit later about me trying to use ChatGPT. But basically, ChatGPT is like the world's worst student. It's extremely confident and knows nothing. So it kept giving me wrong answers. I said, no, that's wrong, try this other thing. No, that's wrong, try this other thing. And everything it would say, oh, I'm so sorry that I got that wrong. How silly of me. Here's the correct answer. It would give me another wrong answer. Loop, oh, I'm so sorry. Here's the correct answer. So finally I said, you keep saying, here's the correct answer, and it's not. And then the next time it said, here's the next answer. So I went around to various experts and I said, what's going on here? And several of them said, well, I don't know. And then I talked to, at Edinburgh, I have lots of colleagues who do know a lot about this stuff, so I went to one of them who runs indeed the generative AI laboratory and said, what's going on here? And she said, oh, it's trained. After you pull out all the stuff and you train it, what's the next best word, you also train it on what prompts it's given and whether what it said is appropriate to the prompt. And that training is done with people. Right? So you have a person that looks at the prompt and the response and then rates it as, was it a good response, was it a bad response? That's training by people. So yes, ChatGPT is amazing, and yes, a lot of it came by stealing data from the web. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also, there's a lot of training by people. So that's what data colonialism means. And so there's a very frightening looking image of data colonialism. But what does this mean? It means you go to Nairobi and you hire people to sit in front of a screen and do things. Or you go to Sofia in Bulgaria and you hire people to sit in front of the screen and do things. I'm not making those up. Those are real firms. The one in Nairobi is called Sama. The one in Bulgaria is called Humans in the Loop. So a lot of this stuff is about hiring people to do this, right? And then they go and they'll say, all right, that's a strawberry, and they'll circle it by hand and label it strawberry or whatever. So a lot of these AI systems, in fact, work because of people far overseas who you can pay less, being paid a pittance to train these systems. That's a very important aspect of these systems to keep in mind, is that they're not human-free. It's just you can get cheap humans elsewhere to train them. I'm looking around. Are there any questions yet? Probably people who want to argue. I did ask you to save that for the end. Okay, so that's data colonialism. Right? Something completely different, right, is there's been a lot of talk about self-driving cars. Here's a Tesla car. You can see it's signaling to turn. It just stops. And all these cars were not expecting that, so they pile into it. So this is Thanksgiving 2023, I think, and 2022, and you get this 8-car pileup. There's another image of it. I particularly like the baby buggy. That makes it very poignant. So, right, just lots of machine learning systems. And there are people who say, well, yeah, it will have accidents, but people have accidents too, and we'll improve the technology and it'll be safer than people. That may be correct. Even when that's true, right, you're going to have to build into these systems some things like there's a baby on your left and a rich person on your right, and you have to run into one of them. Which one do you pick? What do you think OpenAI is going to choose for that? Or that Tesla is going to choose for that? So there are real issues here to deal with, partly technological, partly social, and we need to keep both of them in mind. How many people know of a science fiction author named Kim Stanley Robinson? Just a few of you. So he wrote a book called The Ministry for the Future, where he was talking about how you might deal with climate change, which is another whole important set of issues that we're not talking about here. But in an earlier book of his, so it's well worth a read if you like that sort of thing. But he wrote an earlier book which has a quote in it, which I think gets to the essence of what we need to think about when dealing with climate change, but also perhaps gets to an important essence of what we need to think about when dealing with systems like self-driving cars or deepfakes or all of these other things. And that is what he said was, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. There's this term, the Overton window, about what you're allowed to talk about in the press and what you're not. And right, it's very easy indeed in the press to talk about the end of the world, either from AI, right, the things I showed you, oral stories, or from climate change. Much harder to talk about the end of capitalism. There's beginning to be a movement called limitarianism that says maybe you shouldn't be allowed to earn more than 100 million or 10 million or a billion pounds or a billion zlotys, which would be less. But you've probably read very little about that, because that would be towards the outside of the Overton window. Maybe it's coming in, talking about limiting how much money billionaires can have. So let's talk about daylight robbery. This is another issue. So I mentioned the fact that, right, this is all scraped from the web. So, right, you go around, take all the documents you can find on the web, and that's what you feed in to train this neural net as to what's the next correct word, what's the next most likely word in this text. And as a result, right, you can say to it, give me a poem in the style of Ezra Pound, and it will do so. But you could also take a current author and ask for that. And you could pick a famous author, but you could just pick somebody who, say, is well known for writing technical books. Right? Give me a technical book by this author, and then it prints it out, and you could put it up for sale on Amazon, and no, I'm not making this, I'm not making this up. This is what actually happened. And, right, so it's becoming quite possible to duplicate people. Another example, did people see this in the news with OpenAI and Scarlett Johansson? Right, so about a year ago, OpenAI went to Scarlett Johansson and said, for our chat robot, we would like to license your voice, and she said no. And then they came back a few weeks ago and said, for our chat robot, we'd really like to use your voice, and she said no. And then they released their chat robot, and it sounds like Scarlett Johansson. So she complained about this, and they said, oh, well, as a matter of courtesy, we will withdraw that robot, meaning if we don't, we know you're going to sue us. But, you know, that's Scarlett Johansson, right? She has a lot of pull. Other people, right, need to worry about this. So, for instance, oops. There we go. Sorry. So there's right, there are also systems that generate art. Same thing, they've scraped the web. They can duplicate people's styles when you ask them to. So I went to DALL-E, and I said, generate a self-portrait of Molly Crabapple in the style of Molly Crabapple. She should be sitting cross-legged and using a laptop. And so there's such a thing. There's another such thing. One of those was drawn by Molly Crabapple, and the other was done by DALL-E. So in that case, they look quite different. I didn't have enough time to do the fine-tuning. But lots of artists are quite worried about this, right? There was the recent Hollywood writers' strike where they were worried about it, and they actually got some concessions so that if ChatGPT is used, it can't be used on its own. There has to be an author involved as well. Right? I mean, that one's, right? I love movies that are well written, right? But you often go to movies that, you know, they have a huge budget, but they forgot to pay the writer. And now, again, they're moving towards paying the writer even less by getting some of it to be done by a system that picks the next word. And it would be quite good for generating some of the movies you've seen that are very trite. But if you want an original movie, it would do very poorly at that. And one thing that I'm really worried about is that there may be aspects of art or journalism or science or what have you that will be taken over by AI, will be done by rote, but if you want something interesting and original, that might be quite a bit harder to get hold of, because there will no longer be an economic incentive for somebody to train as an artist, because something good enough can be provided so much more cheaply. So that's something that we really do need to look out for, and where we really do need to use our imaginations to imagine not just the end of the world, but maybe not the end of capitalism, but some restraint on capitalism. And of course, some of the people that said to be at risk at this are us. Right? There are lots of people who have said, oh, look, you can go to ChatGPT and it can generate a whole web page. We don't need developers anymore. I have seen announcements from the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, of a talk by somebody saying, oh, we won't need to train people to be programmers anymore, we will just need to train them to be prompt engineers. I would have hoped the ACM would know better, but I guess the ACM has to give everybody a voice. So you've got systems like Copilot, right? Microsoft's very excited, they've put a new key for it on the keyboard, and it uses ChatGPT-like technologies to help suggest things. And oops, go back. No, go back. Sorry, I'm rotten at controlling these things. Gave away, that's all right. Right, lots of you have used this. Have you found it improved your productivity? A few of you. How many used it and didn't improve their productivity? It got in the way. Equal numbers, interesting. So I found some scientific studies. This one says it improves your productivity by about 56%. So a fair chunk. You can do things faster if you're trained and know what you're doing, making use of one of these assistants. So it does seem to be very, very helpful. Right? I can quite believe that using an assistant like that is much quicker and maybe even more accurate than looking something up in the manual. But of course, what also happens is it makes suggestions that contain security flaws, because it's copying what's out there on the web. There's stuff out there with security flaws, it might suggest a security flaw. It turns out it's slightly more often, in this one study, that it gave you something with a flaw, 40% of the time. But that's an issue. So those of you who said it didn't help, was it because it was suggesting things that were wrong, that had security or other vulnerabilities? I see at least one person nodding. Hands up. Yes, so that is an issue. So we'll have to see where it goes. My best guess at this time, as I say, I'm not an expert, is as things go and the technology gets better, it will be helpful for productivity, and you will need to be very careful about vulnerabilities as well. But I think it's unlikely to actually replace programmers, except for doing very standard things. Yes? Yeah. Oh, the employers are expecting you to use the tool. Interesting. Okay, I'm going to move on because I'd like to finish on time and leave time for some other questions. But thanks, Jakob. That's a very interesting point. Okay, I said I have no right to be speaking here at all. I have a little bit of a right. Oops. Need to learn to use the buttons. I was born in 1956, and that was the same year as the first conference on artificial intelligence, which Ted Chiang, another science fiction author, has said the main problem with artificial intelligence was that they chose a totally inappropriate name. But here are some of the people who were at that conference, people like Claude Shannon, Marvin Minsky, Herb Simon, and John McCarthy. So, and one other is Art Samuels. So Art Samuels, a few years later, came up with the term machine learning, often abbreviated to ML. And it's machine learning from which all of these neural nets and all of the techniques I was talking about descend. But you've also got John McCarthy, who's a founder of our field, right? He came up with Lisp in 1960. He did huge amounts about setting up AI systems that would do reasoning, working with logic. And when I was lucky enough to learn Lisp from him a couple of decades later, he would talk about how AI divided into two halves, which he called the logical half and the heuristic half. So machine learning comes from the heuristic half, but there's this other half, which is the logical half. So in the title, The Two Cultures, that's what I was referring to. There's also a culture of logic. All the things that we were just talking about come not from the culture of logic, they come from the culture of heuristics, machine learning. The other thing John McCarthy would say in class is, it used to be that everything was called philosophy, right? Science used to be called natural philosophy. And then we learned what we were doing, and it got names like physics and chemistry and so on. So as you learn what you're doing, it stops being philosophy and it becomes its own subject. And he and other people have known that artificial intelligence is just the same. Everything starts as being artificial intelligence, right? Even programming languages, Lisp. And then you learn what you're doing, and it gets a name. So a lot of what I do now is working with AGDA and with machine-checked proofs of theorems, or even machines coming up with theorems. So I'm learning a bit about AGDA, about Lean, and systems like that. Lean has gotten good enough that it's actually used by working mathematicians. There's a working mathematician who, top of the field, the Fields Medal, and he had this theorem. He did the proof. He wasn't sure he believed his own proof. So he said a challenge to the Lean community, can you do a machine-checked proof of this theorem? And with his aid, they did that, and then he believed his own proof. So that's quite a significant step for automated theorem proving, which we now call automated theorem proving. But back when I was taking a class from John McCarthy in Lisp, that was called part of AI. So these things spread out and become their own subjects as we learn what we're doing. So among other things, right, this is a paper by John McCarthy on correctness of a compiler for arithmetic expressions. This is the standard exercise of using a stack machine and compiling expressions to a stack machine. You may well have done this as an undergraduate, but it's a classic paper. And he did a lot of the foundational work in proving programs correct was done by John McCarthy back when that was called artificial intelligence. Here's Robin Milner. He did one of these automated theorem proving systems. It used what he called tactics, so that you would take a goal, the theorem you want to prove, and break it into smaller goals that you want to prove using a tactic. And then the tactics were themselves structured in a program written in a meta language, also abbreviated ML and widely called ML. And that was, of course, one of the first functional languages. Lisp was probably the first, but this was one of the next ones. And unlike Lisp, it was strongly typed. So the Hindley-Milner type system is the thing that is used in all of the typed languages that we use today, such as Haskell or OCaml or what have you. And again, being a young programming language person, I was fortunate enough to get to meet Robin Milner. And today I actually hold the chair of theoretical computer science at Edinburgh, which was originally created for Robin. Xavier Leroy then did CompCert, which used Coq, another one of these automated theorem provers, to prove a compiler for C, to write down the spec, and then prove that the optimized compiler for C, so there are some of the phases, is correct. I'm sure lots of people are familiar with CompCert, right? Hands up. Oh, not so many. Okay. So CompCert's amazing, right? You can write a whole optimizing C compiler, specify it, prove it correct, There are people that test C compilers by saying, let's generate programs at random, run them through all the C compilers. If they all give the same answer, it's probably correct. If one of them gives a different answer, then one of them must be incorrect. And so that you do this testing, indeed, you throw up bugs in every C compiler in existence except CompCert. Well, actually, the first time they threw CompCert in, they did find some bugs in the bit of it that wasn't verified, the parser. But then they verified the parser and threw it in again, no bugs. All the verified bits, no bugs. SEL4 is another thing that's worth knowing about. So this is a whole operating system for mobile phones. Again, they specified it, implemented it, and proved that the implementation refined the specification. So every safety property in the specification, like privacy properties, is guaranteed to be satisfied. And the way they did that was they wrote some Haskell code. You can see that. They wrote first in Isabelle, which some of you heard about earlier today. It's another one of these improvers. They wrote the specification. Then they wrote Haskell code, proved that the Haskell code satisfied that specification. And then, so that it would run fast, they translated the Haskell to C by hand and did a proof that the Haskell and the C did the same thing. So you then get an entire phone operating system proved correct. And then you get the Agda language, designed by a few people at Chalmers, colleagues of John. So Coq is the name of one of the theorem provers, Agda is the name of a hen. So it's the opposite, except you don't need to change the name later. So I now know a little bit about Agda. I wrote a whole textbook about it. And so again, when this stuff with ChatGPT came along, I tried it and I said, okay, define addition, prove it is associative. It did that perfectly well. Well, of course it did. It's in my textbook. It could just steal it. And I said, okay, now prove addition is commutative. Nope, got it wrong. Ha-ha, that's in my textbook as well. It didn't read the textbook well enough. So then I said, well, you need some lemmas. It proved the lemmas perfectly well. Couldn't put the two lemmas together to do it, which is why I describe ChatGPT as really the world's worst student. It's very confident and very wrong. But, right, we can put these things together. Right? I just need to run it through Agda to know that it's wrong. Eventually, it could get it right. And I will know. It'll pass Agda. So what if we use ChatGPT to help us write specifications? We don't trust it. We look at them. Wait, is that the right specification? And then we say to ChatGPT, okay, here's the spec. Write a program for me. And write a proof that the program implements the spec. That could work because we can check the proof. So even though ChatGPT is bullshitting, we will capture the bullshit with proof. So putting these two cultures together might be a very useful way forward. So there's an interesting technical idea to end on. So, I have to advertise. Right, so if you are in Edinburgh in August, please come to the Fringe. I'll be giving a talk. I wanted to call it ChatGPT is bullshit, but they said, oh no, American firms are notably litigious. You can't call it that, so it's called Bullshit Bots. And it will be at the Cabaret of Dangerous Ideas, Saturday, 17th August or Monday, 5th August. Please do come. They told me I have to sell 50 seats, so please come. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
So, questions?
Or arguments.
Arguments, yeah.
Yep. So unfortunately, you didn't have a mic, so I'll try to summarize your argument using my mic. I talked about, right, people talk about the misalignment problem where an AI will do something that's not what we want it to do. But you're pointing out we have this other technology, capitalism, and it's also misaligned. It's very efficient, but it's using that efficiency to still dig up lots of oil from the ground and burn it and destroy the climate. So you're saying we've got an alignment problem there. I think that's a very good analogy to make. I like that. I would not say that I don't believe there can be an alignment problem with AI. What I do believe is that it will not be as trivial as what Bostrom hypothesized, right? That the systems that we build, we will have to build them incrementally. They will have to have a lot of knowledge in them. It won't have that bad of an alignment problem. Where you might make the same argument for capitalism. Oh, I'll take it back. The one reason that might have that bad an alignment problem is because capitalism, because people can make a profit by doing it. So capitalism will cause that alignment problem. So capitalism itself is an alignment problem and could cause alignment problems in other technologies. That's a very good point. I certainly wouldn't say we don't worry about the alignment problem at all. I would not say that.
So I would argue that even ChatGPT could be dangerous. Say that you give it arms so that it can reach you. People have talked to it and gotten it to say, I would want to kill you. If it had arms, I mean, it might be dead stupid, really, but if it had arms and kill you, you're still dead.
Well, you don't need to hypothesize giving a large physical presence to ChatGPT, because as I showed, we're already doing this with cars. So absolutely we need to worry about this. Yes, anytime you give AI control over anything physical, you better be careful about that, whether it's a car or robot arms. Did that answer your question, Leonard? Did I agree with you sufficiently?
More argument here, but the ascription of malice to ChatGPT in antagonistic interactions is bullshit, because it is fulfilling, or it is an act. It is the result of the word prediction. When there's an antagonistic interaction that is escalating, you're escalating it as the human actor. It escalates right back. So the ascription of malice to an automated system is as much bullshit as anything else it'll say. Also, thank you for emphasizing the need for proving output of generative models.
There's a microphone at the back as well, if anyone.
Sorry, regarding the Kim Stanley Robinson quote, I would say that, at least for people in Poland and in Eastern Europe, it is possible to imagine an end of capitalism, if not the end, because our grandparents lived through it. It involves getting invaded by a foreign power and being a vassal state for 40 years. So, would not recommend.
So I guess one last question, observation, argument.
I'll try to make it more of a question than an observation. So there seems to be this wave of AI, like you quoted, like from 1956 or wherever, of like every time there's this wave, you have a new generation of systems or systems that are improved over the last generation, and they're doing something a little bit better, right? And it seems like the couple of the last times when I've seen this wave is like every time it happens, the people promoting the thing are saying, okay, it is good enough now. You can deploy it and this is now going to solve our issues and like, or going to replace humans or whatever. Is the current wave at that point, or do we need a couple more to get to that useful level, or what's your opinion on this?
Sorry, what do we need to get to the useful level for what?
For those tools, right? It's like, for instance, self-driving cars, right? Elon Musk was saying that, oh yeah, they're going to come any day now, and he's been saying that for the last 10 years. So are we at the point where those tools are useful and can have a presence on the real world just because we give them arms, to use the metaphor of the previous speaker, or are they useful on or their own, kind of like, they're not stupid, basically, like, or are we not there yet?
So one point I've heard several people make about testing these systems, which obviously you need to do, and regulating these systems, which I think is very important to bring in, is that you can't do it in general, right? For regulation, you have to do it very much on a industry by industry, application by application basis. So we already have regulations about safety for driving cars. Start with things that can pass those tests very well. But I expect, because that's a new area, we'll want to go much further before just handing over things like cars. For something like coding, where it's an assistant and where it goes wrong enough that you pay attention to it, it can be much more helpful. So it'll happen very differently for very different industries. The point is that unless people come forward and say, look, government, we need you to be bringing in these regulations, and we start thinking about what regulations do we want brought in to deal with this huge slew of problems on a case-by-case basis. So it's really a huge amount of work. If we don't do that, capitalism will say, we can make money for it, let's do it. Right, so there's a huge pressure just to do it. We need to come up with ways of taming that pressure. That's, I think, would be my one takeaway from this talk. It's maybe a controversial point. I'm not an expert in this sort of thing, but I hope to at least have inspired people to think about what they want to do along these lines.
Thanks very much indeed. I think that's a great point to finish on. So thanks again, Phil.